So when we run our game, we have two enemies that we've created that come down from the sky. And in our code, remember that we added these enemies this way. First we added their instance variable. And then we instantiated them, and then we added them to the stage. This is great if we have one or two enemies, but we want to have a whole bunch of enemies. So if we're going to create many enemies, we don't want to create them in this manner because we'll have 10 different variables or 100 different variables, and our code is going to get very long and very tedious. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a vector. A vector is a group of variables all of the same type. So to create a vector, private var army, this will be the name of our vector. In fact, I think I'm going to call it enemy army. Then we put the type of variable that we're creating, which is now of type vector. And then we use the dot operator, and we add some generics to our code here that say that our vector is going to be a group of enemy objects. So this is our declaration of our vector, just like we declared our other enemies. And now we need to instantiate this vector. It would be nice if I spelled that right. So we'll say enemy army is assigned the value of new. And now we'll call our constructor. So this is our vector constructor that will construct a new vector of type enemy objects. Now we'd like to add an enemy to our vector. So in order to do that, we're going to add an enemy every frame, let's say. Let's add an enemy to our game. So on our onEnterFrame method, which we've already created, remember that we added this event listener to listen for every time that we entered a frame on our game. So this happens 24 times a second if we are going at 24 frames per second, which we are. So on every 24 or every frame, so 24 times a second, we're calling this method or this function onFrameEnter. Now remember, onFrameEnter, we've already created this function, and we've put some code in here to move our player. And then we added some code to move our enemies down a little bit. So on this function, what we'd like to do is add a call to a new function that we're going to create called addEnemy. So that 24 times a second, we're calling this function addEnemy. Now we need to write this function addEnemy. So here's where I wrote my last function, so I'll put end on mouse move. So remember that you want to write your function outside any other function but before the end of your class. And the name of the function I'm adding is called addEnemy. My addEnemy function has no parameters, but I still have to put the parentheses. Its return type can be void, meaning that I'm returning nothing. And then I put my curly bracket, my open curly bracket, and my closed curly bracket. And this is my end of my function. Now let's write the logic for our function. So first we'll make a new enemy object. So we'll say var new enemy. And we're going to make it the same way that we made these new enemies up above here. So I could copy and paste this code. And then change my name to my enemy to new enemy. So that's the name of my variable. Here's where I'm instantiating my enemy object. And then I add him to the stage. So every time we call this function, so 24 times a second, I'll be adding a new enemy to the stage. Now what I'd also like to do is add him to my vector object. So in order to add him to my vector object so that he can be part of the vector object, first I need to use my vector's name. So I named my vector enemy army. I use the dot operator to call up all the functions of a vector. So here's all the functions that are available to a vector object. And there's a function in here that allows me to put an object into my vector, and it's called the push function. So here's my push function, and inside of my push function I just put the name of my object that I'm pushing into my vector. As long as this object is of type enemy, he will be allowed to be placed into my vector, because remember that my vector can only hold objects of type enemy. Okay. And now that new enemy is given these coordinates, I add that enemy to the stage, and then I push that enemy into my vector so that I can keep track of all the enemies that I'm adding to the stage. Every time that this function is called, it makes a brand new enemy object. It adds it to the stage and it pushes it into my vector. Now it's going to add these enemies at these coordinates. So when I run my code, so I'll save it and I'll run it, I can see that 24 times a second it's adding it to this location right here. Now I haven't told those enemies to move down a little bit, so it's adding it all in the same place and they're all piling up on top of each other right here. So what I need to do is I need to move those enemies down a little bit. So in the same manner that we moved our other enemies down a little bit, we called the move down a bit function from our enemy class. Remember what our enemy class looked like. Here's our enemy class, and here's that move down a bit function. Every time an enemy called the move down a bit function, it added 0.8 pixels to our enemy. And remember that we prefer to write our code like this, plus equals 0.8, which is the same thing that this code was doing, but this is better written. So it adds 0.8 pixels to our enemy every time an enemy calls this function. So we'd like to call that function for all of our enemy objects, so let's write a new function to do that. And we'll call it move enemies. We'll have it take no parameters, so we'll put our parentheses with nothing inside of them. We'll write our new function below our other function, but before the end of our class. So public function move enemies, the parentheses with no parameters, the return type of void, and our curly brackets. This is where we're ending our function. So we'd like to move all of our enemies down a little bit. So we need to iterate, it's called iterate, or move through our entire vector. And tell each of the enemies inside of our vector, to move down a bit. So to iterate through a vector, we're going to use a for each loop. So a for each loop looks like this. You write the keyword for and then the keyword each, and you have a parenthesis. And then what you do is you name your object that you're going to iterate through your vector. So I'm going to have an object of type enemy since my vector is of type enemy. So this says for every enemy object inside of my enemy army, I want to do whatever's in between this curly bracket and this curly bracket. So I'll take the enemy object and I'll tell it to move down a little bit. So each enemy inside of my vector, one at a time, index 0 through index length, will move through my vector And each of those enemy objects will move down a little bit. So I'll save my file. I'll run my game. And now I can see that 24 times a second, an enemy is being added to the stage at the coordinates that I told it to. Then it's being pushed into my vector, and when my vector loops through itself, it moves each of those enemies down a little bit. So it may look a little strange, but it's because all of these enemy objects are on top of each other and they're all moving down a little bit. Not a great way to add enemy objects to our stage. So let's modify that code a little bit. Here's where we need to modify it. We're adding all of our enemy objects to X position 200 and Y position -15. What we'd like to do is add our enemy objects so that they're across our screen. So we need to do a random X position. So what I'm going to do in my add enemy function is I'm going to figure out a random X value. So of course in every programming language there is a way to get random numbers. So we're going to use a class to help us to do that. It is inside of the math class. So math.random. So this is the class name. We know it's a class name because it's capitalized. Here's our function name, random. We know it's a function and it's followed by parentheses. And then we're going to multiply that random number by 400. Let's look at the API for math.random. So we Google AS3 math random. Remember that brings us to the API, the Application Programming Interface. Our directions online to use our programming language. Every programming language has them. And now let's look for that random function, random method. Here it is right here. Let's read what it does. It returns a pseudo-random number n, where n is greater than or equal to 0, but less than 1. So it's giving us a decimal value in between 0 inclusive and 1 exclusive. So we'll take that decimal value and we'll multiply it by 400. Actually, we'll multiply it by 800. By doing this, we now have a random number between 0 and 800. This will be our random X value. Let's replace that 200 with a random X value. We'll save our code and we'll run it. And now we can see that each of the enemy objects is added at a random X value. So it's given a value between 0 and 800. Now if a game was like this, it wouldn't be very fair now, would it? Too many enemies. Plus it starts to slow our game down because we're adding too many enemies and we're looping through that for each loop way too long. So what we need to do is we need to use another random number to figure out when to add an enemy, and only add an enemy, let's say, like 3% of the time, or 3% of our frames. So we're going to use the same logic that we did here. So I'm going to copy and paste this code, and we'll call this rand, and we'll just let it be a value between 0 and 1, and we'll add an if statement here. We'll say if that random number that we just created is greater than, let's say, 0.03, so 3% of the time, then go ahead, and I'm going to indent these because we have a curly bracket and a curly bracket, and we want all of these statements to happen if this is true. So if we get a random number between 0 and 0.03, so 3% of the time, if we get that random number, then go ahead and make a new enemy. Otherwise, this will be false, and we won't create that new enemy, and we'll end our function. So that way we're not adding too many enemies to our stage. We'll save this and run it. And we had too many enemies appearing, and I just realized that we needed to say less than, not greater than. Greater than, that would be 97% of the time. We need to say less than. So we'll save it, and we'll run him. And now we can see only 3% of the time does an enemy appear. So we're getting a lot less enemies. They're a little bit more random when they're appearing, and then we're using random where they're appearing. So we're making multiple enemies come to our screen. They're all being pushed into our vector. And then our vector, we loop through our vector on the move enemies function, and we're telling each of those enemies that are added to our vector to move down a little bit. So now what we need to do is we need a way to defend our player from all of these enemies. So we need to add some kind of bullet or rocket that he can shoot up and hit enemies. So in our next video, we'll have to do that. So make sure your code works before you go to the next video.